حضورنا الكريم، جلستنا القادمة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية. Our coming session will be in English. والآن دعونا نرحب بالدكتور هاري باترينوس، مستشار كبير الاقتصاديين لمنطقة أوروبا وآسيا الوسطى من البنك الدولي، وهو أيضاً عضو من أعضاء المجلس الاستشاري للأكاديمية. سيقدم لنا الدكتور هاري أول جلسة في هذا اليوم، وعنوانها التحول في نظم التعليم العالمية.
Dear attendees, our next session will be in English. And now we start with our first session presented by Dr. Harry Patrinos, advisor of the Chief Economist for Europe and Central Asia region of the World Bank, in his session, Transformation in Education Systems Globally. Dr. Harry Patrinos is a member of the QRTA Advisory Board. Welcome, Dr. Harry.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with you, and I look forward to sharing my presentation. I trust it's online, and
Yes, we can see it online, Dr. Harry.
Thank you. So as we all know, education has a great many benefits for people, their families, their countries. And one of those benefits is that those with more education tend to earn more in the future in the labor market. This is clearly shown in terms of the extra salary that someone earns as a result of their schooling. And that extra salary is higher than any other benefit that you could have for your investment. Beats any other investment like stocks and housing markets, etc. So a year of education is quite important and quite useful for people to better their economic prospects, to improve their well-being, their family, and their future. And the question is where to start in terms of policy for building the education system that will maximize people's returns, both economic and social. And I would say the starting point is information. And we need to know where the education system is, how it's performing, and where it needs to go. Learning assessments can help. I don't mean examinations for selection, but assessments that can help teachers and the administrators to understand students' needs and to use that information to improve learning outcomes. In the last few decades, we've seen an explosion in terms of the amount of information that's available on student learning. And we would attribute this to national efforts, but also international, the many international assessments that help measure learning outcomes and provide needed information to countries and policymakers to make important decisions. And these international assessments can help not only benchmark education systems, but analysis can help identify policies and programs that might help. Today, more than 184 countries have taken part in some kind of international or regional assessment that's comparable over time and comparable across countries. 184 countries is almost the whole world. But it was not always this way. There was a time when we had very little information about how country systems were performing and very little comparable information. And what this data has told us is that we, although we're doing well in terms of getting children into school, and we see convergence in enrollment rates around the world, we're not seeing much progress in terms of learning outcomes. And this is pre-COVID data. So even at the best of times, learning outcomes had been quite flat. at least since the beginning of the 21st century. So we have a real challenge in that the world's successful in getting kids in school, but needs to do a lot of work to improve learning outcomes. And then COVID comes along, and at a time when nearly 2/3 of all children cannot read with understanding. So we had a crisis before COVID, and we have a crisis now with COVID and the school closures. And we can analyze the impact of COVID in terms of learning outcomes, test scores, basically, and make predictions about people's future earnings. Since we know that another year of schooling raises earnings by about 10%, then any reduction in schooling, whether the duration or the quality of schooling, should also have an impact on future earnings. The data on the learning outcomes has been out for some time now, and we have data for several countries, not the whole world, but many countries, and the learning losses are severe in some cases. And in some countries, they equal 2 to 3 years of schooling, so even more than the duration of the school closure itself. This is alarming because it shows that schooling had a big impact on people's ability to learn and learning outcomes. So therefore, its absence has been a real challenge for countries to guarantee learning outcomes. So long school closures have not been useful for student learning, and with limited benefits in other sectors. And we see quite a diversity in terms of learning losses across the world, with some countries experiencing very, very little learning loss. At the end of the screen, you can see Sweden with 0 learning losses. Of course, Sweden didn't close primary school, so there was no learning loss. But then there's other countries that did have school closures, yet learning losses are close to 0. And I would point to Denmark, Japan, France, for example, along with Australia, countries that had very little learning loss. Others had, various levels depending on the duration of the school closure, but more importantly, in terms of the policies they took. And that's what I want to highlight. I think what COVID-19 and the school closures demonstrated is how important school is for people's life. And we know this because the absence of schooling meant severe learning losses, and also how important teachers are, and the interaction between teachers and learners in real time. Physical presence has been very important. So we have no real substitute for physical presence in the teaching and learning process. And third, we learned that very difficult to address learning losses with distance education. Something else has to happen. The point I want to make in the duration of this talk is that policy really matters. Actions that we take in favor of learning outcomes can make a big difference, and some of the countries on this chart demonstrate that. So the response to the pandemic, to the school closures and the aftermath of school closures, because most children are back in school now. There's a urgent need to implement learning recovery programs. We know a little bit about what works. We also need to address very quickly the resource needs for education systems, because after all, if the absence of schooling led to these learning losses, then something needs to happen in terms of addressing these deficits. And we may need more teachers, more teacher aides, more resources for the education system. So therefore, we need to protect the education budget. But what we've seen in many countries around the world is a reduction in school budgets. Not everywhere, but in many countries. And finally, there will be other shocks, hopefully not as severe, but there will be other shocks or reasons to close schools or temporarily, hopefully. So we do need to prepare for these future shocks, make the schools as safe as possible, and try to facilitate continued learning. The most important thing, however, above all, is to measure learning outcomes continuously and to use this information to align policies, to address the learning challenges for all students. In terms of learning recovery programs and what's worked, nothing new, direct interaction between teachers and students is needed, but also additional resources. And one program that's worked before the pandemic and during the pandemic is tutoring. A very expensive program to bring essentially extra teachers to address learning needs when it's face-to-face. But during the pandemic, there were experiments with online tutoring, and these worked quite well. Some of the evidence suggests tremendous learning gains as a result of the online tutoring. In Italy, where the lockdown was quite severe, if the online tutoring was implemented nationwide, it would have eliminated the entirety of the learning loss experience in Italy. Pilots in Spain and the US also showed positive outcomes. And it doesn't even need to be high tech, even using telephones and SMS messaging managed to reduce learning losses in lower income environments as well, at a very low cost, very, very low cost compared to what tutoring would have cost if it was in person. So one way that online education worked was through the tutoring that supported students as they struggled during the lockdowns and school closures. So policy matters, actions taken to address learning needs directly can work. And the message I want to make is that policy matters. And I want to go back, way back in time to make this point. And the reason for that is that we've had learning assessments only since the 1960s. I mean, international assessments, and very few countries took part in those early assessments. 7 countries that I was able to identify: Australia, Finland, France, Germany, Japan, Netherlands, and the United States. So back in the 1960s, the first experiment with international assessments that can be comparable, that can lead to some benchmarking and analysis of policies. And the question is, what can we learn from these 7 countries that participated in the 1960s and continue to participate in all of the major international assessments that we have? And not all of these countries today, they're all high-performing, high-income countries. They weren't always high income. Finland back in the 1960s was a middle-income country, and learning outcomes in some of these countries were not so high back in the 1960s. So what can we learn from just this small sample of countries, but important in the sense they've been involved in assessments for a long time? The first lesson is that it's difficult to have conversion in schooling outcomes, so difficult to sustain. We can improve education outcomes in terms of enrollments and years of schooling, and all these countries have done that. It's more difficult to sustain gains in learning outcomes over a long period of time. Second lesson we have is that schooling, especially quality schooling as measured by test scores, is a necessary component of economic development, and I'll show some of that in a moment. And the third lesson is that we need to sustain these programs. So whatever works needs to be maintained, and we need to stay focused on learning outcomes. So sustained leadership and a focus on learning is needed to continuously improve learning outcomes. So if we look at some of these countries and how they performed over time, and you can see the big gaps in schooling, just years of schooling for some of these countries. So back in 1980, the U.S. was way ahead of the rest of the world. Finland and Japan far behind. But over time, these gaps were reduced severely, and also the level of income in these countries grew significantly over time. And we have achieved income convergence in most of these countries over the decades. We've also seen in these countries that even though the level of education has increased, and it's increased a lot, maybe on average doubled from just over 6 years to about 12 years in the early 2000s. And the returns to education, the wages associated with more schooling started to go down, but they've actually started to increase in recent years, showing that there's been a change in labor markets and the demand for higher level skills. So the quality of education, if anything, matters even more now than it did back in the 1960s. So we're seeing an increase in the demand for schooling and an increase in the demand for quality education. This, of course, demonstrates the value of education has continued to be important. Of all these 7 countries, one country stands out. Japan continued to improve throughout this period. Japan was number 1 in 1965. Among these 7 countries, it's still number 1. And you can see that Japan has continued to improve despite some PISA shocks, as they would say, in the early 2000s.
Dr. Harry, you have 1 minute left, please.
Okay, thank you. So the result of the schooling changes, and the biggest change that we've seen is in the case of Finland, which improved its education system over time, starting with a massive reform in the 1970s, and they managed to improve learning by a whole standard deviation. What's a standard deviation? Learning outcomes, that's more than 3 years worth of schooling compared to the rest. So Finland goes from the bottom of the chart to close to the top of the chart in a relatively short period of time, a generation really. So policy meant a lot. It's been evaluated, and we know that Finland's reform did lead to significant improvements in learning outcomes. Japan continues to be the country to follow, with a continuous set of reforms that have been well studied, the lesson study program, for example, but other reforms that address curriculum needs and continue to keep Japan at the top of the rankings. Question is, who's next? Which countries now have improved quality significantly over the past decade or so? I would leave you with a couple of suggestions, some you've heard from already. Poland has made significant improvements in the last few decades as a result of policy changes that are well documented. And the other country close to home for you is Jordan, the first Arab country to participate in international assessments, which led to a significant reform that improved learning outcomes significantly over a relatively short period of time. Thank you.